Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Colleen McClung will present Circadian Rhythms and Bipolar Disorder. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation funds the most innovative ideas in neuroscience and psychiatry to better understand the causes and develop new ways to treat brain and behavior disorders. These disorders include addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, and schizophrenia. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $394 million to fund more than 5,700 grants to scientists around the world. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in grants to the scientists. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Colleen McClung. Dr. McClung is Professor of Psychiatry and Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, was a Foundation Independent Investigator Grantee in 2016 and a Young Investigator Grantee in 2005 and 2007. Today's webinar will begin with her presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, use the question tab on the control panel on your screen. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. I will ask as many questions as time will allow after the presentation. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. McClung. Colleen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be with you today. And I really want to thank the Brain and Behavior Foundation for supporting our work for all of these years. It's been really a pleasure to work with everybody on this research. So I'm going to start out today with some of our, just a background on bipolar disorder and on circadian rhythms, and how we think that bipolar disorder and circadian rhythms are regulated together. And how circadian rhythms are involved in this disease that affects so many people. If I can get my screen to start.
Simply click on the screen.
Yes, I got it. Okay.
Thank you.
And can you just see my slides, or can you see the web?
Yes, we can.
Just my slides. Okay, great.
Yep.
So I'm going to start out with what is bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is a chronic psychiatric disorder characterized by the occurrence of one or more manic or mixed episodes. People usually also experience depressive states in this, with periods of sort of normal mood or euthymia in between. So basically, it's an episodic disorder where people have these periods of both mania and depression. And it can be highly comorbid with other disorders, such as addictive disorders. It pretty much equally affects men and women. And the median age of onset is about 25. And the prevalence is about 2 to 4% of the population, depending on which study that you see. So it affects a large number of people. So what causes bipolar disorder? So it's usually a combination of the genes and something with the environment. So about 80 to 90% of people with bipolar disorder have a family history of some psychiatric disorder. It can be bipolar disorder as well, but also could be major depression or schizophrenia. It's interesting that some of the recent genetic studies that are coming out suggest that there are some common genes that confer risk for a variety of psychiatric disorders that seem to run in families, but how they lead to either bipolar disorder or depression or schizophrenia remains a little unclear. So you can see in this table the risk of developing bipolar disorder if you have a relative that has the disorder. And what you can see is that even if you have an identical twin, that's still only 70% risk. So there's something with the environment as well. So something like early childhood trauma can contribute, or stressful life events can contribute. So it seems to be some combination of genetics and environment. So circadian rhythms are a process that regulates every single thing that goes on in our brain and our body. And circadian rhythms are really interesting in the context of bipolar disorder because they are controlled by genes, and so there's a genetic component, but also, of course, controlled by the environment. And so every single process in our brain and our body revolves around a 24-hour clock. Things like coordination, body temperature, of sleep, of course, all are regulated over this 24-hour cycle. We know that the master pacemaker is located in an area of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. And this is a part of the hypothalamus that is responds directly to light. So there's light input from your lights in your office or from the sun that come in through retinal ganglion cells in the eye, and these will project directly back to this part of the brain, the SCN. And the SCN acts kind of like the conductor of rhythms throughout the brain and throughout the body. So circadian genes are actually expressed on almost every single cell in the body. But without the SCN, they would just run on their own time. They would be out of sync from each other. So the SCN acts as the conductor of the orchestra of all the rhythms in the brain and in the body. So circadian rhythms in today's world are being affected by a lot of environmental factors. These include things like light at night, shift work, travel across time zones, inconsistent sleep-wake cycles. These are things that when we were evolving as humans, we really didn't have in our environment, and it's more of something that we now have to deal with in modern day. And this is a picture of light at night around the world. You can see that now we have so much artificial light at night. And so these kinds of things are really disrupting our circadian rhythms. There's also effects of puberty and aging on circadian rhythms. So teenagers have a natural biological shift in their rhythms where they want to stay awake later and wake up later. This is a natural process that happens that's associated with puberty. And so this, paired with very early school start times, creates a situation in which you have a mismatch of the natural circadian rhythms and the time in which they're having to get up. And this is a situation that we call social jet lag, where there is this mismatch during the week as kids are going to school, and then they're sleeping in on the weekends. So this is another way that circadian rhythms are being disrupted, especially in teenagers, which are a vulnerable population for mental illness. There's also, of course, a lot of use of electronic devices at night that can impact your clock and further delay rhythms by having that exposure to particularly blue light at night. And circadian rhythms are also regulated by genetics. So whether or not you're a morning person naturally or an evening person naturally or somewhere in between, this is largely regulated by genetics and by that circadian clock. At the molecular level, circadian rhythms are regulated by a transcriptional translational feedback loop, which is occurring in every single cell in the body. And this is regulated primarily by the proteins clock and BMAL1, and I'll talk more about the clock protein a little bit later. These are the primary activators of transcription, and they regulate the expression of a number of genes, including the period and cryptochrome genes, which when they become proteins, they go out into the cytoplasm of the cell. They're modified by a number of factors. And then they go back into the nucleus and they inhibit the activity of clock and BMAL1. And this sets up a transcriptional translational feedback loop that occurs over the course of 24 hours, every single cell, every single day. And again, this regulates all these biological processes that have circadian rhythms, and disruption to these genes can affect a number of things, including sleep problems and mood. So we've known for a long time that people with psychiatric disorders have very abnormal clocks. So depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia are all associated with major disruptions in sleep and activity. And in fact, sleep disruptions are one of the key diagnostic criteria for these disorders. We also know that more than anything else, changes in schedule can precipitate manic or psychotic episodes. So someone could be going along fine, and then they work a night shift or they travel overseas. And this is really a factor that can set off an episode, and in particular, a manic episode or psychotic episode. These seem to be really linked with some kind of change to the normal sleep-wake cycle. We also know that depression is diurnal. Often the worst symptoms are in the morning. It's often seasonal. Seasonal affective disorder is one of the most common mood disorders. And a lot of bipolar patients have a seasonal presentation where they have more mania in the spring and depression at night, in the winter and in the fall. This doesn't occur with everybody, but it's a fairly common type of presentation. And depression occurs more frequently in areas of the world where there's little daylight for long periods of time, like Alaska, places like this. We also know that people with a preference towards eveningness, so night owls versus morning larks, are more susceptible to depression. And the vast majority of people with bipolar disorder seem to have that kind of evening phenotype, which again can make them out of sync from the working world or the school world where you have to get up early. And we know that polymorphisms in several circadian genes have been linked to psychiatric disorders. And in particular, the clock gene has been associated with bipolar disorder, that clock gene that I talked about in the previous slide. So this is just an example of some of the ways that circadian rhythms could be changed or abnormal. So the first at the top here is delayed phase sleep, where people are going to bed very late at night and waking up very late. There's also advanced sleep phase, where people are doing the opposite, where they're going to bed very early and waking up very early. This tends to occur mostly in elderly people. As you age, sometimes your circadian rhythms shift to earlier and earlier. And then there's a normal sleep phase in the middle for comparison. Then people can also have irregular sleep-wake patterns, where they just kind of have fragmented sleep patterns, where they don't really have a clear circadian rhythm to their sleep-wake cycle. And people can have what's called non-24 sleep-wake rhythms, where they're not able to entrain to the light or other stimuli that helps to entrain rhythms to a 24-hour cycle. So people's endogenous rhythms, most people tend to have a slightly longer period than 24 hours. So if you don't have that light input, then what happens is your clock would just delay a little bit each day. And this is typically found in people who are blind, who don't have that retinal input to the suprachiasmatic nucleus to allow the clock to be really set on a 24-hour cycle. So their clock tends to kind of drift every day. So these are just ways in which circadian rhythms in certain people can be disrupted. This is an example of what these rhythms look like. So this is a study that was using actigraphy. So this is like a Fitbit or some other tracking device that you put on your wrist. And what it measures is your activity and your inactivity or sleep time. So the black bars here is when the person was active and where it's clean is where they're sleeping. And you can see over the course of days that this healthy control subject has pretty regular circadian rhythms where they're active during the day and sleeping at night. And you can contrast that with somebody with bipolar disorder, and this is somebody particularly in the manic phase where they have very long activity patterns across multiple days and then sort of go into a long sleep pattern. So you can tell that these rhythms are just highly disrupted in this particular patient. We also know from studies of people with depression that the strength of circadian rhythms can be associated with mood directly. So in this particular study, they looked at rhythms in body temperature, rhythms in cortisol, rhythms in norepinephrine. So these are just peripheral factors that are known to have very strong circadian rhythms. And when they look at depression scores, they find that essentially the stronger the amplitude of these rhythms, the less depression that people have. And the lower the amplitude, so if the rhythms are very weak, then this is associated directly with greater levels of depression. So there seems to be a real direct correlation between the strength of these rhythms and the degree of depression that people feel when they have major depressive disorder. So people have been thinking about this association between circadian rhythms and mood disorders for a long time. Even in the 60s, Franz Halberg suggested that some, but not all, circadian rhythms in bipolar patients were not synchronized with the 24-hour day-night cycle. And so his hypothesis was that the interaction between the unsynchronized or free-running rhythms and the normally synchronized or entrained rhythms can cause switches back and forth between mania and depression. So basically, he's suggesting that at a biological level, there's a mismatch between the internal rhythms, in maybe even in particular parts of the brain, and the external rhythms. And there's this kind of fight between the rhythms that is causing switches back and forth between mania and depression. Ehlers and Frank and Kupfer had devised this theory where they figured out that that there was abnormalities in the circadian pacemaker, and that this was related to the precipitation of stressful life events. And when stressful life events happened, that this led to changes in social Zeitgebers, and then this led to social rhythm disruption. So changes in your schedule and your sleep-wake schedule. And then this led to biological rhythm disruption and eventually other somatic symptoms leading to affective episodes. So this was a theory that that had gone on for that they had developed back in the 1980s to suggest a reason how circadian rhythms could be involved in triggering episodes in bipolar disorder. So there have also been studies in the human brain that have suggested that molecular rhythms are disrupted in psychiatric disorders. So one of these studies found that in using human postmortem brain, that people with major depressive disorder had a very strongly disrupted molecular clock. And this is kind of illustrated here, where basically they found that a lot of genes that were normally rhythmic in people with in control subjects, that people with major depression had a real loss in the rhythmicity of a lot of these genes. So the genes in red are the controls. In the control subjects, they normally have a circadian rhythm in their pattern, and these are lost in people with major depression. What's really interesting, too, about bipolar disorder is that when people travel in different directions, or there's different kinds of changes in the circadian cycle that seem to be associated with different episodes. So there was this study that was done back, again, in the 1980s, which looked at people who were traveling either east or traveling west. And what they found is that when people were traveling from east to west, they tended to have greater levels of depression. When they were traveling west to east, they tend to have greater hypomania, which is really interesting that it seemed like these two different states were either going east, where you would be phase advancing your rhythms, or going west, where you would be phase delaying your rhythms, that these might be associated with either the development of mania or the development of depression. They are also studies of gene expression in people that were hospitalized with bipolar disorder, which showed that this kind of followed the same pattern where the genes that were expressed, and these were genes in the periphery, so genes just from cheek swabs, in people with bipolar disorder when they were manic, that their rhythms tend to be really fast, really far advanced. And when they were depressed, their rhythms tended to be very delayed. And as they got better, then they went back to normal. So we think this is really interesting that these different kinds of circadian phase changes might be associated with different states. So in our lab, we've used a mouse model to try to understand some of the biological processes that are going on that contribute to how circadian rhythms and circadian genes are involved in the development of bipolar disorder. And so we used this mouse that was originally identified by Joe Takahashi and Martha Vita-Turna back in the 1990s. And this mouse has very disrupted circadian rhythms. So these are rhythms in wheel running. And the wheel running, you can see when the mice are active, they're black. You can see these black marks. And when they're not running, it's clear here, similar to the actigraphy that I showed earlier. But the clock mutant mouse has really very disrupted patterns of activity. So it's very hard in a mouse to be able to know, how is the mouse feeling? Is it feeling anxious? Is it feeling depressed? And so we kind of have to use some behavioral measures to get at the mood state of the mouse. And so we use things like forced swim test, learned helplessness test, open field, elevated plus maze, these kind of tests which basically put mice into a situation that they don't like or they can't escape. So for example, the forced swim test, they put mice into a bucket of water, and they won't drown, they'll float, but they try to escape for a while, and then they sort of give up and decide, it's not worth it. And this is kind of called behavioral despair. Same with learned helplessness, kind of where they're put into a situation they can't escape, that they don't like, and then you measure how much they're willing to try to escape once they're given an opportunity. Tests like the open field, elevated plus maze, and dark light test measure exploratory drive and the amount of time that an animal will explore an anxiety-provoking environment that they don't really like that much. And then we have things like condition place preference and sucrose preference, which can measure reward. So how much an animal likes to be in a context where they're in a situation where they've gotten something like a drug of abuse or a social contact in that context, or how much they like a sugar solution versus just a water solution. So these are measuring reward or lack of reward, or anhedonia. So we found over the years that the clock mutant mice look very similar to bipolar subjects, mostly in the manic phase. So they're very hyperactive. They sleep less than wild-type mice. They have less depression-like behavior in a number of those assays that I mentioned. They have increased impulsivity, risk-taking, novelty-seeking in a number of behavioral models. And they're more sensitive to the rewarding effects of everything. So drugs like cocaine, alcohol, sucrose, brain stimulation, you name it, these guys really love it. And if you give them lithium or valproic acid, then it reverses their phenotype. So we think that this is a really nice model in which to test kind of the role of circadian genes in psychiatric disorders, and also to look at how drugs like lithium or valproic acid, which are still the first-line treatments for bipolar disorder, might be acting in the brain to control these types of responses. The mice also kind of show cycling, so they, if we test them during the day when they're supposed to be asleep, this is when we see really this manic-like behavior. So this is in the top here, we have the center of the open field, or the time spent struggling in the tail suspension test, which is another test very similar to the forced swim test, where mice are kind of held by their tail, and you measure how much time they struggle. What you can see is that during the day, during the light cycle, that they're showing this sort of manic-like behavior. And then during the night, they're kind of going back to normal. And this is also shown below in the dark light test and in sucrose preference. So it seems like every day they're kind of going through this cycle of a manic-like state during the day, and then coming back to normal at night, more of like a euthymic state. So they are doing this kind of daily cycling between manic and depressive-like behavior. Or sorry, manic and euthymic-like behavior. We don't really get them to go into a depressive-like state unless we do something like stress them. But at the very least, they're going through this this sort of cycling, be it on a daily basis, albeit on a daily basis. And but we think that this is really interesting for helping to understand, particularly how episodes are precipitated. We decided to focus on dopamine since dopamine is really important in a lot of psychiatric disorders. We know that mania is associated with increased dopaminergic transmission in striatal regions, so while some other models of depression are associated with decreased dopamine. We know that antipsychotic drugs antagonize dopamine receptors, particularly the DRD2 receptors, and that all drugs of abuse activate the VTA dopaminergic system. So stimulants like cocaine directly bind to the dopamine transporter. We've focused a lot on the brain reward regions that produce dopamine. So I'll just be talking about this region, the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, which is one of the major dopaminergic centers in the brain. So what we found when we record from neurons is that the clock mutant mice tend to have increased dopaminergic transmission, and that this is reversed when we give the mice lithium. So when we give lithium, we see a reduction in dopaminergic activity, and we don't see that in wild-type mice. So we think that lithium is acting to reduce dopamine when it's in a pathological state, when it's in a state where it's too high. Okay, so then we decided to look across the 24-hour period, and we did in vivo recordings now where we put electrodes directly into the VTA, and we measured dopamine activity during periods of REM sleep. So this is when the mice are resting and they're in periods of sleep. And the reason we did this is we didn't want to have the mice anesthetized, but we wanted them to not be moving around. And what we found was that when we looked in the morning, that we found an increase in dopaminergic activity during the daytime. And then it kind of came back down, but still remained higher than wild-type mice the rest of the day. And so what this suggests is that that there's an increase in dopamine that's going along with that precipitation of these manic-like behaviors during the light phase. So when mice are supposed to be asleep, they're getting too much dopamine, this surge of dopamine, and that this is a time of day maybe where the circuit is not really prepared to handle it. And so perhaps you're getting this switch to a manic-like state because you have dopamine at the wrong time of day. When we looked at firing rates in dopamine cells where clock has been knocked down just in those cells, we find the same thing where we get this increase of dopamine, so dopaminergic activity. So what this suggests is that that it's really clock in those dopamine cells that's causing this problem. And again, when we knock down clock in those dopamine cells specifically, so the rest of the animal is totally fine, they have normal clock, then we see changes that are similar to what we see in the clock mutant mice, and this is just showing alcohol preference. So when we take out clock just in those dopamine cells, they drink more alcohol. They like more alcohol. So again, it suggests that clock is really doing something important in the dopamine cells to regulate reward and other behaviors that are associated with a manic-like state. To further kind of test this, we took an approach that was like gene therapy, where we put back a normal clock protein directly into the VTA of otherwise mutant animals. So here we have animals that are clock mutants, and we're rescuing their clock expression just in the VTA. And this is able to rescue some of their behaviors. So you can see locomotor behavior and anxiety-like behavior. They go back down to normal when we rescue clock expression in those dopamine cells. So again, suggesting that clock is playing a very important role in those cells. We found recently that dopamine is actually, while it's increased in the VTA and striatal regions where it's released, actually in the prefrontal cortex, we see a reduction in dopamine levels. And this is interesting because this is what's been associated with schizophrenia in the past, is that there's this thought that there may be too much dopamine in striatal regions, but less dopamine, too little dopamine in cortical regions. And this might be responsible for some of the not only the psychotic symptoms associated with too much dopamine in striatum, but some of the cognitive functions that are associated with too little dopamine in prefrontal cortex. So how does lithium work? So I showed you that lithium reduces dopaminergic activity in the VTA, and so how does that happen? And so one of the things we did is we looked at gene expression and which genes might be modified in the clock mutant mice and then following lithium treatment. And what we found is that there was this particular gene called CCK, or colchicystokinin. It's a peptide that is co-released with dopamine, and that it acts to inhibit further dopaminergic activity. And we found that CCK levels were really downregulated in the VTA of clock mutant mice. But then with lithium, we got a reversal of this, where we saw that lithium was able to rescue levels of CCK in the clock mutant mice. We also looked at the VTA of bipolar patients on medication and on and off medication. And these are in human subjects now in postmortem brain. And we found that the bipolar subjects that had been on medication at the time of death had increased CCK levels. So it suggests that maybe lithium is acting to increase CCK, and maybe that's acting to reverse some of those changes in dopamine. And at least acutely, this might be what's going on with lithium. We also showed that if we knock down CCK, specifically in the VTA of otherwise normal mice, that this can induce manic-like behavior like we see with the clock mutant mice. So this is shown here with increased, at the top, increased hyperactivity. And then in the elevated plus maze, and the dark light, and then in the forced swim test at the bottom, we see that we get a very similar phenotype to what we see with the clock mutant mice, where if we're just recapitulating that knockdown of CCK, then we get an increase in these sort of manic-like behaviors. And importantly, if we prevent lithium from increasing CCK, then this prevents lithium's action on behavior. So here and again in a number of behavioral tests, when we use a technique where we just put in a control that doesn't do anything to CCK, then we see that lithium has behavioral effects in the elevated plus maze, in the dark light test, and in the forced swim test. But then when we prevent lithium from being able to activate CCK, then we don't get any behavioral effects of lithium on those tests. So we think that at least in the clock mutant mice, that CCK is important in this action of lithium. So in the longer term, we think that a lot of the treatments for mood disorders are having some effect on the circadian clock. So things like bright light therapy, total sleep deprivation, social rhythm therapy, which I'll talk about, melatonin or agomelatine, which is an antidepressant that's used in much of the world. Lithium, SSRIs, valproate, all of these treatments for mood disorders affect the circadian clock in some way, and I'll get into them a little more detail. So social rhythm therapy is a therapy that was developed here at the University of Pittsburgh, where people are put on a very strict social and sleep-wake schedule. And this is shown here is an example of a social rhythm metric. So people will indicate their time out of bed, their first contact with another person, the time they start school or work, the time that they're at dinner or to bed. And the idea is to have people be aware of their normal schedule and to try to stay on as consistent a schedule as possible. And this will, again, help prevent the precipitation of episodes. So as I mentioned before, the thing that really can precipitate episodes more than anything else is a change to schedule. So if you can keep people on a very strict schedule, this is going to help to prevent mood episodes. And indeed, here's some of the data that shows that compared to just intensive clinical management, so another kind of behavioral therapy, that with interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, you can actually get a faster change in occupational functioning. So this particular score, it's better to be low. And then this actually persists for a couple of years out, and suggesting that, interpersonal social rhythm therapy is leading to greater occupational functioning in a shorter amount of time than some of the traditional psychotherapies. And this is an example of somebody on social rhythm therapy. So here, this is, again, an actigraphy plot where somebody's wearing one of those wrist monitors that is tracking their activity. And you can see on the left how disrupted this rhythm is in somebody with bipolar disorder. And then you can see just to the right of this, their mood measures during this time. So negative is depressed and positive is manic. You can see they're kind of all over the place. But then when they're put on, the same individual, when they're put on a very strict sleep-wake cycle, you can see that their mood also stabilizes quite nicely. So this suggests that this therapy is really helping to prevent those episodes from happening. Another variation on this is dark therapy, where people are put on sort of extended bedtime, or at least kept in a condition where you don't have blue light that's coming in at night. Sometimes people will wear glasses, these goggles that kind of filter out the blue light. And in this particular study, this is one that was done a while ago, where somebody was put in basically 14 hours in bed, and then later on 10 hours in bed during the night. And you can see at the top their mood. If they were in their usual routine, they had periods of depression, periods of mania, and their sleep was really all over the place. But then when they were put on this night therapy or dark therapy, their sleep again stabilized, and so did their mood. So this can be, again, an effective treatment to try to keep those episodes from happening. Recently, Dorothy Sitt and some others have looked at the effect of bright light therapy for bipolar depression specifically, and here they're using daily bright light at midday, so between 12 and 2:30. And it's important that it's at midday. So other studies have shown that if bright light therapy is used in the morning for people with bipolar depression, that it can switch them into mania. And so you have to be very careful with bright light. And so this is a study where they're using bright light therapy in the midday. And you can see by about week 4 that they're starting to get a lot of people going into remission versus the inactive treatment. So we know that drugs like lithium and valproic acid are increasing molecular rhythm amplitude. So they're really, I told you that the way they might be acting in the short term, at least lithium, is through changing this dopaminergic activity. But we think in the long term, they're acting kind of like social rhythm therapy, where they're stabilizing and enhancing circadian rhythms to try to keep people in that entrained state. So these are 2 studies of cells in a dish, basically people's fibroblasts. And what they're doing is they're measuring circadian gene expression. You can see these rhythms in gene expression here. And when lithium is given or valproic acid is given, then you can see that the rhythms get stronger. And so we think that this is one of the ways in which these drugs might be acting as mood stabilizers. And there are new compounds that are being tested. This is one that was developed by Pfizer. It's a casein kinase 1 inhibitor that has direct effects on the circadian clock. And so in this paper, they gave this drug to mice. And they found that it basically did the same thing as lithium or valproic acid in making rhythms stronger. And it also entrained rhythms in mice that were compromised, the mice that had a mutation that compromises their circadian clock, or mice in constant light, where they gave the drug where this black bar is. And this is, again, wheel running activity, and you can see it very nicely synchronized their rhythms. So we gave this drug to clock mutant mice, and we were able to see that it also reversed a lot of their behavioral phenotypes that were similar to mania. So in the elevated plus maze, the forced swim, dark light test, we saw that this drug worked pretty much just as well as lithium at kind of normalizing their behavior in a number of these different tests. So these kinds of drugs represent maybe the next generation of therapeutics, which might be doing similar functions to lithium and valproic acid in terms of stabilizing the circadian clock, but maybe won't have all the side effects that those drugs have because they're more specifically targeting this system. And they will help in terms of, behavioral techniques like social rhythm therapy are great and can be very useful. But these drugs might also act as an adjunct to those sorts of behavioral therapies. And so we'll see. The clinical trials on them are just starting, so we'll see how they do in the future. So in conclusion, I've shown that bipolar disorder is associated with major disruptions to the circadian system, and an altered circadian clock could be potentially a causative factor in the disorder. Disruptions to the normal sleep-wake schedule can precipitate episodes, particularly manic episodes. We're learning a lot about how circadian genes regulate dopamine and other functions in the brain that regulate mood. So it seems like they're really directly regulating these neurotransmitters that are involved in mood regulation, and so that's very important in helping us understand why disruptions to the circadian clock can have such an impact on mood. We're also learning more about how mood stabilizing medications act on the brain, and that stabilization and amplification of the circadian clock represents a novel therapeutic target, we think, for the treatment of bipolar disorder. So I'll stop there and thank the members of my lab who contributed to this work. Our collaborator, Kafui Dizaraza from Duke, who helped us with some of the electrophysiology studies. And our funding, especially our funding from the Brain and Behavior Foundation, NARSAD, who funded some of this work very early on. So thank you.
Well, Colleen, I want to thank you for the work that you've been doing, for your excellent presentation. I apologize to you and to our audience for some of the technical glitches, but I appreciate that we were able to have you present all this information. I want to ask you a little bit more about what people can do right now with regards to this information. So if people want to make use of the circadian clock and circadian rhythm to help them with controlling bipolar disorder, what do you do? What do you actually tell a person and maybe their family as to steps they could take to make use of this information?
Yeah, so I think that, what you could do right now really is try to have the circadian clock be as regulated as possible. And this includes things like getting out in the morning and getting sunlight, and exercise which will help to get your clock set for the day. And then at night, avoiding a lot of that blue light. So, not using too many electronic devices at night, not being in brightly lit environments when it's late at night, and really trying to stay on a very, regular sleep-wake schedule. These seems to be things that can be done right now that are going to be beneficial and just help to, to keep everything on track and going the way that it should be, so that you don't have those precipitation of episodes that can occur with a dysregulated schedule.
I think that's very good advice, and often people who are sticking to that kind of schedule, sometimes an early warning sign that maybe they're moving towards a depression or moving towards a manic episode is some change in that schedule. And they could then speak with their psychiatrist, other members of the treatment team, to say, it looks like maybe I'm moving in this direction or that direction. What should we do? But that's an early warning sign when people fall out of that schedule.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, it's good to work with the psychiatrist to be able to see if there's any kind of warning signs that suggest that an episode is coming, or if there has to be some change to the schedule. If you have to travel, if you have to do something that's going to be a major change to the schedule, maybe to make them aware of that, so that you can plan in case an episode happens because of that.
I know that sometimes people take over-the-counter substances such as melatonin, especially when they're traveling. And I'd like you to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so melatonin is fairly safe. There aren't too many studies that show any real harmful effects of it. It can make people a little bit drowsy sometimes if they take higher doses of it, but it will help with traveling in terms of resetting your clock a little bit quicker potentially. It's not really, all the trials that have looked at melatonin as a treatment for depression, let's say, have not really been all that fruitful. So if people are taking it as an antidepressant, I don't think that's really going to help very much. Agomelatine is a melatonin receptor agonist and a 5-HT2C, a serotonin receptor antagonist, and it's been approved in much of the world as an antidepressant. It seems to be a little bit more potent than melatonin itself. So, I mean, it may be helpful to some people to take it, particularly when traveling, but I wouldn't say it's going to be a miracle cure for, especially for depression.
Okay, and thank you for that. And the often people when they're experiencing a depression, whether it be bipolar or unipolar depression, have some aspect of circadian rhythm that often the mornings are worse than later in the day. And I'd like you to comment on that aspect of the circadian clock.
Yeah, that is a very common phenotype to have with depression, where people seem to have worse symptoms in the morning. And that's probably does have something to do with the way that the circadian clock is misaligned with the environment. As I mentioned, a lot of people with depression and bipolar disorder are sort of evening types, where they prefer to wake up later and go to bed later. And so oftentimes, if people who are evening types have to get up early in the morning to go to school or to go to work, you know, this is creating this, as I mentioned, this case that's like social jet lag, where you're in this perpetual state of misalignment, where your circadian clock is off. And so it could be that one of the reasons why people have, you know, the worst symptoms in the morning is because that's when they're kind of experiencing that maximal jet lag effect, and then it kind of gets better through the day. So, but still, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to really understand those diurnal properties of depression, and why it seems to be strong in certain people.
Is there a role that exercise can play in helping people sort of maintain a good rhythm?
Yes, absolutely. So exercise can really help to keep rhythm strong, and obviously it can help you sleep at night, which is another important point. So light and exercise during the day are going to actually give you better sleep at night, and to help keep your rhythms intact. So yeah, exercise definitely will be helpful for that. Also, the time when you eat can help to entrain circadian rhythm. So it's best not to eat in the middle of the night, because then that's also getting your clock, you know, out of whack. So it's best to kind of eat regular meals during the day, and, you know, not eat too late into the night. Exercise during the day. Those are all things that are going to help entrain your circadian clock.
And how about the effects of caffeine, coffee, soda with caffeine on this whole issue?
Yeah, there haven't been a whole lot of studies of caffeine on circadian rhythms per se, but there's been a lot more on sleep. And so obviously, you know, caffeine in the evening can really disrupt your sleep schedule, and can throw off your sleep. But yeah, there haven't been a ton of studies about looking at like coffee in the morning, for example, and how that might help to set, or it may be beneficial in helping to set your clock. Honestly, I'm not really sure. We'd have to do the study to see it. But again, just like eating late at night, I probably would not recommend having caffeine late at night, because it's going to potentially disrupt your clock if you're doing that later in the evening.
Well, Colleen, I want to again say thank you for the work that you've been doing, for joining us today. I think it shows how basic science can help inform clinical care today, and also develop new treatments down the road that can have a tremendous effect on people's lives. So thank you very much for all that you do.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today. All of the research we fund is made possible through private donations, so please consider making a contribution by visiting our website, bbrfoundation.org, or calling us directly at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it with a family or friends, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. I hope you'll join us again next month when Dr. Gerard Sanacora, Professor of Psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine, Director of the Yale Depression Research Program, and Co-Director of the Yale New Haven Hospital Intervention Psychiatry Service, will present Crossing the Goal Line, Bringing Ketamine Treatments to the Clinic. This webinar will take place on Tuesday, May 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you again for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.